Following Trump's illegal and unprovoked attack on Iran, Western politicians have pushed out a familiar line. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said this: Iran's nuclear program is a grave threat to international security. Iran can never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon, and the US has taken action to alleviate that threat. The situation in the Middle East remains volatile, and stability in the region is a priority. We call on Iran to return to the negotiating table and reach a diplomatic solution to end this crisis. Now, I'll repeat, that was Keir Starmer's response to America bombing Iran. The United States bombed Iran, and his response is that Iran should return to the negotiating table. Let's go to Ursula von der Leyen. Iran must never acquire the bomb. With tensions in the Middle East at a new peak, stability must be the priority, and respect for international law is critical. Now is the moment for Iran to engage in a credible diplomatic solution. The negotiating table is the only place to end this crisis. Now, again, this is after Iran was bombed by America. It was a standard line trotted out by Western leaders. I don't want to sort of pick out Starmer and von der Leyen in particular, because this was really across the board. And the problem with it is, I'm sure you've guessed by now, it's complete bullshit. So anyone with a memory longer than a goldfish will remember that Iran did, in fact, come to the negotiating table and sign a comprehensive nuclear deal with the Obama administration in 2015. Here's how the then president announced that deal.
Today, because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region. Because of this deal, the international community will be able to verify that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. This deal meets every single one of the bottom lines that we established when we achieved a framework earlier this spring. Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off.
The Iran nuclear deal was negotiated and agreed by Iran and all 5 members of the UN Security Council, as well as Germany. And that was in exchange for sanctions relief. And Iran agreed to eliminate its stockpile of medium-enriched uranium, cut its stockpile of low-enriched uranium by 98%, and reduce by about 2/3 the number of its gas centrifuges. Now, centrifuges are the kit needed to enrich uranium. Iran, as part of the deal, also agreed that for 15 years, uranium would only be enriched up to 3.67%. So that's obviously way below the 90% needed for weapons. And crucially, this is critical, the International Atomic Energy Agency would have regular access to all Iranian nuclear facilities to monitor compliance. Right? It was a good deal with almost universal support among the international community, and it allowed Iran a chance to develop economically while having a civilian nuclear energy program. Right? So it was good, right? Obama was there saying, this makes sense, Iran can develop, we're safe from nuclear weapons, yada, yada, yada. One man, though, wasn't willing to go along with it. You've guessed who, Benjamin Netanyahu. He repeatedly agitated against the deal and sparred with Barack Obama, as this report from 2015 shows.
To defeat ISIS and let Iran get nuclear weapons would be to win the battle but lose the war.
Netanyahu said the deal John Kerry is negotiating would let Iran get a nuclear weapon. Iran's Foreign Minister Zarif asked about Netanyahu.
But I don't think trying to create tension and conflict helps anybody.
Netanyahu pulled out all stops, even addressing Elie Wiesel and invoking the Holocaust.
I wish I could promise you, Elie, that the lessons of history have been learned.
The alternative that the Prime Minister offers is no deal, in which case Iran will immediately begin once again pursuing its nuclear program, accelerate its nuclear program, without us having any insight into what they're doing.
Now, as we'll come to in a moment, Obama was just right there, right? History has borne that out. Netanyahu, though, had a powerful ally in American politics. Again, you've guessed it, it was Donald Trump. As a presidential candidate, he said this in September 2015.
So I've been doing deals for a long time. I've been making lots of wonderful deals, great deals. That's what I do. Never, ever, ever in my life have I seen any transaction so incompetently negotiated as our deal with Iran. And I mean never.
Now, Trump could never really explain why he didn't like the Iran deal, except for the fact it was negotiated by Obama. But despite the International Atomic Energy Agency saying it had verified that Iran was implementing all its nuclear-related commitments, in 2018, Trump left the deal and introduced crippling sanctions on Iran. And this is from a crisis group report in 2020 on the consequences for the country of those sanctions. So they say since 2017, and again, this is written in 2020, the Trump administration has continuously tightened the noose of sanctions on Iran, targeting more than 80% of the country's economy. There can be little doubt that this maximum pressure policy is inflicting considerable economic harm on Iran. Economic growth that followed the lifting of sanctions in 2016 has given way to an inflationary recession. And they go on, the Iranian currency has lost 2/3 of its value, and oil exports, which are a crucial source of government revenue, have dropped from 2.5 million barrels per day to less than 0.5 million barrels per day, despite exemptions for humanitarian trade. Human rights groups and international aid organizations operating in Iran report the adverse impacts of sanctions in areas such as medical imports, emergency relief, and refugee assistance programs. Now, this maximum pressure sanctions campaign was kind of the strictest sanctions regime ever introduced on a country. Not only was Iran sanctioned by America in the sense that sort of America wouldn't trade with them, but America would sanction any country that traded with Iran. So it was complete isolation, complete economic warfare, which was terrible for their country and society and their health. And the consequences of that in terms of nuclear proliferation or Iran's nuclear program was also very predictable. So this chart shows the number of installed centrifuges across Iran since 2011. So centrifuges, they're the spinning machines used to enrich uranium. By 2016, when the nuclear deal was signed, Iran had almost 2,000 centrifuges in operation. Once the deal was signed and in operation, they had almost none, right? So none were operating. Once the deal was ripped up, though, the number in operation rose dramatically, so to around 15,000, we believe. So it's basically what Obama suggested would happen without a deal. If you rip up the deal and isolate Iran, that will only encourage them to race towards nuclear weapons. Now, again, it's not even official they're going for nuclear weapons, but they are clearly enriching uranium beyond the level which it's needed for domestic energy production. So why were they doing it? I mean, it has been suggested the jump in the nuclear program and in the enrichment of uranium was as much about political messaging as a plan to actually build nuclear bombs. So by showing you can make nukes, in theory, you increase the incentives for the Americans to re-enter negotiations for a deal. And the director of US intelligence said this to Congress in March.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
Iran was also actively engaging in negotiations with the US to, like in Obama's nuclear deal, agree to limit the enrichment of uranium in exchange for sanctions relief. In April this year, in fact, Iran and the US concluded a first round of talks on Iran's nuclear program, which both sides described as constructive. Later that month, the US said further progress had been made in a third round of nuclear talks. And by the end of May, Trump said he believed the US was close to reaching a new Iran nuclear deal, and he told Israel not to disrupt the talks. But either Trump was actively misleading the Iranians or Netanyahu was willing to ignore Trump because on June the 13th, Israel blew up talks by bombing Iran and, get this, attempting to kill the man in charge of negotiations. So that man is named Ali Shamkhani. Israel originally announced that they had killed him, but Iran then said that he had in fact survived the attempt on his life, I think severely injured. So in short, Iran signed a deal. Trump ripped up that deal. Iran entered negotiations with Trump to sign a new deal. Then Israel bombed their chief negotiator. Then America bombed Iran. So how did the British government respond when Trump joined the Israelis in bombing Iran? Well, we've shown you Starmer's tweet. And this is who the UK government sent out onto the Laura Kuenssberg show on Sunday morning.
We support, and always have done, the prevention of the Iranian regime obtaining nuclear weapons. You're right to say we hoped and proposed a peaceful diplomatic means to do that. It was the Iranians who were not willing to go along with that.
That was Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds taking his turn to twist logic on its head in order to defend Donald Trump trashing Obama's legacy and illegally bombing a sovereign country. Ash, many things to say. I mean, gaslighting on an industrial scale, it makes you feel quite mad watching all of these people saying it was Iran that walked away from the negotiations. They have to come back to the negotiating table when they were at the negotiating table when they were bombed. I mean, also, it's kind of strange that this is kind of a long-term beef between Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And it's kind of as if all of these Labour politicians have decided that Trump was right. They're all siding with Donald Trump against Barack Obama.
So the reason why Labour politicians are pretending that Iran walked away from the negotiating table and this is all Iran's fault is because we don't have a foreign policy of our own. And the space that we're trying to carve out now, which is, oh no, Mr. President, please don't make us go to war with Iran, is conditioned by the fact we're so scared of Trump's tariffs as well. So you have decades of simply hitching our entire foreign policy posture to Washington. And then when Trump comes along, and I think that, there is a clear majority, an electoral majority in this country against forever wars, is that the space in which this government has to operate is very, very narrow. And that's not just the fault of Keir Starmer. That's been the case for decades and decades. And one of the worst offenders, of course, was Tony Blair. But to talk about industrial levels of gaslighting, I just want to share with you an experience that I had on Friday evening. So on Friday evening, I did a Radio 4 panel show called Any Questions. And it's basically like Question Time, except on Radio 4. And the other guests were a Labour MP called Peter Prinsley, someone employed by Chatham House called Bronwyn Maddox, and a Tory MP, formerly Theresa May's advisor, Nick Timothy. And not one of them mentioned that Israel is a nuclear power, that Israel has never signed up to non-proliferation treaties, that Israel has never allowed international inspectors to see whether or not they are developing or have developed nuclear weapons. So if you want to talk about a missing portion of the coverage and of the political discourse around it, it's that there is one country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons, one country that is currently involved in multiple hostilities and also ground invasions of its neighbors, and it's not Iran. So you've been talking about the idea that we live in this kind of topsy-turvy world. I mean, one way in which the world is topsy-turvy is that all of the things that Israel actually does, it's somehow being transferred onto Iran as a case for war and a case for regime change. Now, Israel, has been covertly developing a nuclear weapons program, for decades and decades now. I've not heard, one American politician or one British politician say, well, it's time for regime change in Tel Aviv. I think that this is really the period in which the pretense that the UK and the US believe in international law is gone for good. There is no such thing as international law anymore. It's no good invoking treaties, because while Iran, I'm sure has not necessarily been wholly transparent with international inspectors and whatever, I wouldn't expect them to be. They played ball. They said, okay, we want to lift the sanctions. We're going to do this through diplomatic means. We're going to strike an agreement with Barack Obama. If you are an ordinary Iranian and you're looking at those years between 2015 and 2018, where they were signatories to an agreement to highly, highly curtail their nuclear program, would you now at this point think that's time well spent? I think possibly no. I've always argued against nuclear proliferation. I don't like living on a planet where multiple countries have the ability to destroy the Earth many times over. However, I can't think of a better case for the nuclear deterrent than what Israel and America have done in the past week. Because I think Aaron Bassani put it best when he said they've made it very clear that sovereignty only exists insofar as you have nuclear weapons if you're not going to cleave to the Washington consensus. There's a reason why we're not invading North Korea. And so if you're an ordinary Iranian, and you may well be opposed to the theocratic regime itself, you might be looking at the bombs falling on Tabriz or on Tehran and thinking we should have really spent that time developing a nuclear weapon, because then this wouldn't be happening. So I can't think of a worse a worse series of events for nuclear non-proliferation. I think that the idea of diplomacy and agreeing treaties, particularly with America, that's out the window. No right-thinking country should think that America will abide by a treaty that you agree with it if the next president can come along and tear it up. And there's also one last thing that I want to say, which is if you want to know who's really in charge of American foreign policy, don't look to Washington, look to Tel Aviv, because Netanyahu has gotten everything that he wants. Everything that he wants. And that's the reason why he does so many press conferences and makes so many statements in English and not in Hebrew, because his audience isn't a domestic Israeli audience. His audience is an American audience, and in particular, a Washington audience. That's why there have been these signs in English popping up in Israel saying, Mr. President, finish the job. It's an appeal directly to America. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, like many American presidents before him, but I think it's particularly acute with him, has been utterly led by the nose. This adventurous war, where we don't know what's going to happen next, and it's quite possible that there'll be a long and drawn out conflict with huge repercussions for the region in general. This started out in Tel Aviv. Like it was something that Netanyahu wanted to do, and rather than seeking permission first, instead what he did was he just went for it, totally confident that Washington would come wading in behind him, and he was right. He was completely right. Again, this isn't something that you hear very much of, from Keir Starmer and David Lammy, because they've also been led by the nose by Netanyahu, particularly when it comes to their initial support for collective punishment in Gaza, cutting off food, fuel, and water to the 2 million people there. And it would be embarrassing for them now. They're in too deep. But shamefully, it's not something which is discussed in the media either, because quite frankly, most media in this country adopts as its common sense the positions of liberal Zionism.